105.9 Academy FM.
The sound of Folkestone.
Now it's time for Alice's series of features in our Explore Kent strand, this time about the Romney Marsh and its Visitor Centre. Now, the Marsh has an outstanding heritage and several different environments that are unique to the area. This week on Explore Kent, Alice spoke to Steve Humphrey, the man in charge of the Romney Marsh Visitor Centre, which not only looks after the environments on the marsh, but also plays host to several community projects. In the first part of this interview, Steve talks us through the new art gallery that's on the site and takes us through some of the Marsh's rich history.
I'm Alice and I'm here at the Romney Marsh Visitor Centre with Steve Humphreys, and we're going to be taking a look around the site. So Steve, give us an overview of what you do here at the Visitor Centre.
Well, basically we've got the Visitor Centre itself, which is a straw bale building, and in that building there's a permanent display which demonstrates the history and the wildlife of Romney Marsh. The building functions as a Kent Wildlife Trust visitor centre, but also very much as a tourist information centre for Romney Marsh, because there's no alternative. Outside we've got 23 acres, which is largely local nature reserve, and much of that is a site of special scientific interest. And within the outside areas we do a lot of community projects, which include a community garden, which is open to all local residents, but we also work with groups of adults with learning difficulties and people with mental health problems. We've also just opened an art gallery. Art galleries are few and far between on the marsh, which is surprising considering we've got so many artists locally. I'm hoping that that's going to bring a lot more visitors onto the site, and currently we have a local artist exhibiting there, and the exhibitions change about once a month. Last year we built a replica of a looker's hut to sort of promote the heritage of sheep farming on Romney Marsh. And so visitors can actually see one of these buildings. They're pretty unique to Romney Marsh. And also we've got an interpretation panel which tells the visitor about the history of sheep farming and lookers. And also there's a little gizmo that you can turn a handle and you can listen to recordings of the last lookers talking about their lives.
Okay, so let's go on a tour.
Okay.
Right.
Well, first we'll have a look in the new art gallery. One of the features of the outside areas on the site is our ponds. Most of the ponds we've got on the reserve are seasonal ponds. They tend to dry out during the summer, which is good for wildlife. Those sort of ponds sustain a proportionately more rare species than ponds that stay wet all the year round. This one, however, is the only lined pond on site, and it's a demonstration really for people who come and visit us how they can design and build a pond for their garden that's suitable for wildlife. And we hold various workshops throughout the year for people on gardening. Right, this is the art gallery, which was basically a redundant wooden building, as you can see, and that's why we've called it the Art Shack. And we received a little bit of funding from the Chain Court Wind Farm Community Fund to refurbish it, and the aim is to enable this facility to be used by predominantly local artists who otherwise wouldn't have access to a gallery space. The other thing we always ask our artists to do is, during the period of the exhibition, to put on one public workshop, and that can be a workshop for adults or children or whatever. And what I try and do is to get a variety of artistic styles in here, and as I say, we change the exhibition every month, so we get a good throughput. And so far we've got a very good response from artists. I've got a lot of artists as contacts now who all want to exhibit, and we've also got our own website.
So is the art gallery a reason why some people come to the Romney Marsh?
Well, I'm hoping it will be. It's only really been open just under a year now, and we've already seen more people come specifically to see the art gallery. But of course, art itself, painting, photography, has been a draw for lots of people to the Marsh for a long, long time. So I'm hoping that this gallery will be another focus for that and will draw more people in. These are the seasonal ponds, or some of the seasonal ponds on site. As you can see, here we've got about 2 or 3 feet of water. During the summer months, this will all be completely dry, this area. And so every year they undergo that cycle.
If the Romney Marsh returned to its natural habitat, would it look something like this?
Well, that's a bit of a difficult question, because, of course, naturally the Romney Marsh would be a salt marsh. So it would be covered by salt water rather than fresh water. This is all fresh water. There's no doubt that possibly if the Romney Marsh became wetter and wasn't drained as it is today for agriculture, certainly in the wetter areas you would get willow trees, these are predominantly willow trees, growing up to form this sort of habitat. But as I've said, if it went back to what it was originally, it would be really salt marsh. So you get probably bits of both, a bit of salt marsh near the coast and some wetland scrub like this.
Does that mean that if the seas were high or there were storms, that the marsh would get flooded?
Well, of course, we rely on the drainage we've got and the coastal defences, but if they failed and the sea levels rose extremely high, then most of the marshland is below sea level. So yes, it would flood. This is the Lucas hut replica. It's an exact copy of one that stood at Cutter's Bridge near Midley, and these were built between the 18th and 19th century predominantly, and they were used by the lookers, who were self-employed shepherds. They would work for several landowners, and so they would look after sheep all over the marsh. So they may look after 500 acres of sheep pasture. So in order to make things easier for them, they would keep their tools, medicine, presumably some spare clothing in these huts, so they wouldn't have to carry those things from flock to flock. And then during the lambing period, there would be pens out here, which I've yet to construct, but they would stay in these huts for up to 6 weeks at a time. They would actually live in them. And then the ewes would lamb, and any sickly lambs would be brought in by the fire. There's a little fireplace in there. And at the heyday, there were a lot of sheep on the marsh, up to 250,000 sheep, and there were 350 of these huts. And they're pretty unique to Romney Marsh. You don't find similar farm buildings to this anywhere else. Maybe a few on the Isle of Wight, but these are pretty unique to the marsh. And now, out of those 350, there are probably about a dozen sites where you can see a whole one or part of one. So we're trying to preserve their memory by building this one, but also I'm trying to preserve some of the ones that are in disrepair out on the marsh as well.
Are there actually any lookers' huts that are in use currently?
There are no lookers' huts that are in use as they would have been, no. I think there's one hut in Camber which is still actively used in sheep farming, but not in the way that the lookers would have used them.
Can we go inside and have a look?
Yep, please do. So.
So can you tell us a bit about what's in here?
Right, it's a very simple construction. The building is about 12 feet by 9 feet, and it's got a simple brick construction with a clay tile roof. It's got one fireplace, one door, and one window. The looker would probably just have slept on an old armchair in the later days of the hut's usage. Maybe in the early days there would be bags of straw that he would have slept on, and all the sort of tools that he would use he would keep in here, and medicines for treating the sheep if they were sickly.
When did they fall out of use?
Well, really, it was probably the Second World War that stopped them being used as they were. Obviously, during the Second World War, sheep farming largely stopped on Romney Marsh. 160,000 sheep were evacuated from the marsh in 1940, and much of the marsh was obviously ploughed for food production during the war years. After the war, the sheep came back, but the methods of sheep farming had changed. But having said that, there were lookers working in the 1950s, certainly. And we have recordings that were done by a local historian of interviews with them in the 1970s, remembering their times as lookers.
Please turn me till the message plays.
Shepherding? Yeah. He was a heifer looker. So much of a heifer, and I was under him.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
So what would you have been called then, a sort of second looker?
Under shepherd.
Oh, under shepherd.
Well, under looker if you like, or whatever you like to call it.
Yeah.
But it's all this shepherding, but we always used to call lookering.
Yeah.
We was always called lookers in them days.
Yeah, I always refer to Romney Marsh shepherds as lookers, and I think they ought to be.
Certainly, yeah. Because they go to look around for every day, 7 days a week.
Yeah.
When the centre was built, which was now about 9 years ago, there was already a history of horticulture on site. The areas here were used by Shepway Volunteer Centre, who provide volunteers to work on gardens in the Folkestone area for elderly or disabled people. And the larger area is the horticultural unit, which was originally used by South Kent College to provide training in horticulture, particularly for adults with learning difficulties. What I've done in this area was to take over these sites to promote organic gardening and gardening for the benefit of wildlife, and also make something of interest to visitors. So in this area, we designed a back garden, basically, with a little pond, a shed, a cottage garden area, an overgrown lawn area, herb garden, and then some vegetable plots, ending in, at the far distance, the soft fruit cage and some rhubarb, and of course the compost bins at the end. Up on the bank there we've got 4 beehives, and in the centre there we've got an area of garden where we use raised beds and all sorts of containers for gardening. So basically we try to demonstrate to visitors what they can do in their own gardens.
Is there anything about the particular soil on the marsh that makes it good for growing particular plants?
Well, of course, Romney Marsh in general has got excellent soil because of the way in which Romney Marsh was formed. So most of the marsh is excellent for growing crops of any variety. Having said that, I am trying to garden here on sand and shingle. So we have to improve the soil a lot by adding manure. We don't add any artificial fertilisers. As far as the climate is concerned, well, we're lucky because we're in the far southeast of England. It's a mild climate, and we have a little bit of a microclimate on Romney Marsh, which makes growing reasonably good, although we do have a relatively low rainfall. So we still have to find ways of keeping the plants watered.
If conditions are so good on the Romney Marsh, why aren't farmers growing crops rather than keeping sheep?
Well, they are now. I think roughly about 30% of the marsh is sheep pasture, and there are about 50,000 sheep now on the marsh, but that means that 70% of the farmland on the marsh is now arable farming of crops of all sorts, potatoes, beans, grain crops, etc.
What gave you the idea to create beehives as well, and is it a particularly successful project?
What we're trying to do is to demonstrate to visitors what's important, not just in gardens, but in nature, and about biodiversity. And of course, bees are extremely important in that. I mean, we can't garden, we can't farm unless we've got animals to pollinate the plant. Okay. So this is the community garden, and 2 years ago we received a big lottery fund grant to refurbish this building here for use by volunteers, and it also funded project officer to work here with all the groups. So now for the next few years we at least have Catherine funded, and that means that we've got to look for more funding after that. So this is the community garden area. We've got 3 polytunnels here. As you can see here, in addition to the polytunnels, which are very useful to us because they allow us to increase the length of the growing year, and they also provide some of our volunteers with a bit of shelter. If the weather's not too good, they at least have got somewhere to work under cover. We've also got quite a few raised beds, and in the distance over there we've got some allotment type plots where we grow all sorts of vegetables, and we also grow some soft fruit. So predominantly this community garden is used by lots of local people, and there's space for lots more, and all the produce is shared out amongst the people who work here. And so if anybody fancies coming and growing their own, if they haven't got a garden, or if they had a garden, they've downsized now, then it's a good opportunity. The way the marsh formed was originally, that ridge you can see there was the line of the sea. So this area that's the Romney Marsh was just a large bay with rivers entering into it. That was about 6,000 years ago. And during the Ice Age, the channel had become covered with shingle. When the sea levels rose, that shingle started to move from west to east, as it does today. You see the shingle moving on the beach. And a shingle bank was thrown up across the mouth of that bay. And roughly where we're standing now was that shingle bank, which protected that bay from the sea. And so that bay became a salt lagoon. The rivers were bringing salt down into that lagoon, and gradually that was deposited, and over many years that became a salt marsh, and gradually became drier and drier. And so by the time of the Roman occupation, about 100 AD, the part of the marsh up towards the northeast there was occupied by Britons, and their main occupation was salt production. Over the next few hundred years, the Anglo-Saxons realised that this ground was potentially good for growing crops, and so they were the ones that started to just improve the drainage a little bit by digging out the creeks on the salt marsh. They just dug them out and improved them.
So in terms of the landscape, how did the marsh change from being somewhere where salt could be collected to being somewhere where sheep were farmed?
Well, originally all of the marsh was a salt marsh. That's where the name came from, having formed behind a shingle barrier. And gradually, more and more silt is brought down by the rivers, and so this tidal salt marsh gradually becomes silted up, more silted up, and various plants colonize the salt marsh, and then they trap more and more silt themselves. So gradually the natural process is for the salt marsh to dry up. And also, after the Anglo-Saxon period, then man started to give it a bit of a hand by improving the drainage and realising the potential of the agricultural land.
And you mentioned earlier that the sheep and the lookers would have been evacuated during the World War. What was the marsh's role during that war?
Well, of course, the marsh is, and has been for many, many years, in a very strategically important position. And so we can go back even before the Norman conquest. It was always a point where raiders might enter the country. So it was certainly thought that the German forces might well land on the coast of Romney Marsh. So there was a plan to flood the marsh on purpose in the event of a German invasion. And so that's why most of the non-essential personnel and all the sheep were evacuated in 1940.
How would the flooding of the marsh have been achieved?
Well, basically, you would have to have a good high tide, and then all you would need to do is to open up the sluices at high tide, and rather than the water draining out, the seawater would flood in.
And going back before the war, did the marsh have a very big role in smuggling?
Yes, well, particularly during the sheep farming period, the profession that grew up on the marsh alongside it was smuggling. Virtually everybody was involved in it during the 18th and some of the 19th centuries, and it was seen as, in certain parts of that time, as an act of political rebellion, so it was hardly seen as a crime. But yes, smuggling started really on Romney Marsh.
What sort of species can we see on the marsh?
Well, the marsh consists of a number of very important habitats. It's obviously got a lot of wetland habitats, so freshwater life is very important. The water vole, which is declining nationally, is important on the marsh. Amphibians such as the great crested newt, and also lots of plant species are very rare nationally. The greater water parsnip is one of them, and the marshmallow plant, which is very scarce nationally. And there's a moth called the marshmallow moth that relies on that plant. And the marshmallow moth is really only found on Romney Marsh and probably one other location in the UK.
Would you say that the Romney Marsh is a unique environment?
What we call the Romney Marsh, that 100 square miles, is many unique environments. As a total, it is absolutely unique. There's nowhere like Dungeness anywhere else in Britain, really. But the combination of the various habitats across the marsh, the farmland, the coast, makes it a pretty unique habitat and very, very important for wildlife.
So now we're standing outside of the visitor centre itself. Tell us about the building and what you do here.
Well, this building's been here now for 8.5 years. It's a straw bale building. It was the first public building in the UK for the walls to be constructed of straw. It has a living roof. It's got sedum that covers the whole area of the roof, and so that means that we've replaced the vegetation taken up by the footprint of the building. The heating we've got inside is a wood burner, and we have renewable energy sources in the form of a wind turbine and 5 solar panels. So we're almost self-sufficient in power. The building, because of that, promotes green lifestyle, and people come just to see the building and also to discuss their own plans in renewable energy. Of course, because this is a Kent Wildlife Trust Centre, we are here to promote wildlife conservation throughout Kent, but particularly on Romney Marsh. And this visitor centre is slightly different from some of the others because we also act very much as a tourist information centre and promote the marsh as a tourist destination, and we hope that visitors to the marsh come here when they arrive. They pick up their leaflets on things like the churches and they discuss it with us so we can point them in the right direction.
And how important is it that people visit the marsh?
Well, I think it's very important because obviously the general global economy is pretty poor at the moment, but the marsh economically is vulnerable, and the more visitors we can get from around the UK and from abroad to spend their money on the marsh, the better. It is a little sort of haven in the middle of, or at the edge of southeast England. There's nowhere quite like it to visit.
And finally, regarding the marsh's future, what do you think needs to happen to keep it thriving?
Well, of course, we've got to try and create jobs, particularly for the young people on the marsh. We don't want the marsh to become depopulated. So there has got to be some sort of way in which to achieve that. Whether that's by a new nuclear power station or not, I'm not sure. One of the things I want to do is to promote green tourism on the marsh and to try and improve and increase the tourism infrastructure on the marsh. And I think that in itself could provide a reasonable number of long-term employment prospects.
Steve Humphrey, site manager at the Romney Marsh Visitor Centre, was talking to Alice Taplin.